Welcome to the lecture on liberalism. Today we're going to talk about the theory of liberalism, neoliberalism, and in a way also talk about neorealism when we're talking about neo debate in international politics. So let's recap where we are. We are currently at a place where we're studying international relations. And this is sort of an important nuance that I want to make and remind everyone that we're studying international relations theories because these theories allow us to explain whys of why war happens, why peace happens, why trade happens, why crisis happens. So in many ways, theories are not the reasons why these things happen. They're sort of explanatory tools as to sort of understand why or how these things happen. So far we talked about history when we were talking about colonialism, etc. Because history provides us with information about the past and that these things that we're talking about today are interconnected in many ways. So history then is a great starting point to study the patterns. Theories, on the other hand, allow us to make sense of the world that we live in. They are not tools that explain causes of things, or they don't cause things per se, but they explain actions, patterns, and events. And international relations, as the academic discipline, studies international relations, the set of activities. In that sense, the theory and practice are interrelated, that they inform each other. So let's take a moment to study liberalism. Well, liberalism is a theory whose origins go back to 18th and 19th century, where sort of they combine economic choices and philosophical understandings to create an understanding of the political. Here, perhaps it's important to talk about liberalism as a philosophical canon that focuses on the difficulties of establishing just, orderly, and peaceful relations between peoples, but perhaps also between states. In classical liberalism, individuals are seen as rational actors that have the liberty to choose their own fate, that it's the thinking human that is at the sort of the steering wheel of their own destiny. In international relations, liberalism was driven by scholars who were deeply interested in schemes which would promote cooperative and sort of peaceful relations among states and allow for a realization of a just and peaceful international order. And in discussion groups, we talked about the concept of perpetual peace as sort of put forward by Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher who reflected on questions of liberty, liberalism, social contract, etc. So there's Immanuel Kant's understanding of peace, or the Kantian peace, was built on understanding that the world should consist of republics, which are better than monarchies or dictatorships for purposes of peace, and that this global order should resemble a looser federation of republics, that they're sort of part of a republic federation, and that international law and law in general should be the sort of perhaps the ordering principle of the international order. And you might see this to sort of go opposed to our understandings of anarchy. Well, that's because sort of perhaps Immanuel Kant understood the effects of anarchy, but pushed forward an understanding or sort of an impetus for establishing an international actor that acted basically in the same way an international sovereign would. But rather than sort of dominating the system, it would be a looser federation or sort of a confederation of republics that were sort of governing their relations among themselves through international law. To end the concept of war, or to end all wars, liberals believe that states need to respect stable institutions, rule of law, and right and freedoms of states. So after the end of the First World War, there was an audience for this kind of sentiment, given the sort of the destruction and the catastrophe of the First World War and how it changed the world at the time as they knew it. So in 1918, following the Paris Peace Conference, the victorious powers put forward an understanding of something called the League of Nations. And League of Nations then became sort of an interesting international relations experiment during the intra-war period. And League of Nations was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, who is the gentleman in this picture. But the problem with the League of Nations and the American involvement, Woodrow Wilson was the American president at the time, was that when the League of Nations was, the treaty was signed, the United States was unable to ratify that treaty. So the way that the United States foreign policy works is that the American president is able to sort of negotiate or act foreign policy, but the agreements or the treaties have to be ratified by the Congress. So the Congress did not ratify the League of Nations Treaty, which meant that the United States, even though it was a major actor, the central actor in a way, in drafting the League of Nations Treaty, it was not there to oversee it or be part of it. So, League of Nations in many ways have failed, and we will talk a little bit about what that means and what that does in a second. But let's take a step back and think about what liberalism is and what its assumptions are. Well, liberalism assumes that rationality and inherent good nature of humans is a central driving force of social order, and that there is potential of interest among people. Cooperation, thus, is possible and, in fact, a central feature of human relations. And cooperation happens through government. So government is a tool of necessity. And that individual liberties are of supreme importance, supreme political importance. So, what are some deductions from liberalism? Well, if humans are inherently good, then states as a collective polity would have no interest in pursuing wars. And if centralization of power is bad, then pluralism and democracy must be a superior form of political organization. And if cooperation is possible, then it must be possible to achieve positive changes in international politics. Now, we have talked about the idea of rational behavior. And in social sciences, generally in international relations, it means something particular. It means an actor's ability to carefully weigh up the costs and benefits of any course of action. So in instrumental terms, what that means is an ability to pursue one's own interests, to do a cost-benefit analysis and to pursue one's own interests as needed. But it's also an ability to understand moral principles and basis and live according to the laws. So it's that rational behavior in many ways. For example, as we've maybe talked about in discussion groups, at least one of the discussion groups, one of the reasons why we don't commit crimes is because maybe we're afraid of committing crimes. So we make a cost-benefit analysis and sort of say, well, if we get caught, then we'll go to prison or we'll pay a penalty. So it's better to not do laws. That's the rational calculation. That, in many ways, is a rational conclusion. So in some ways, liberalism is often also, in international politics at least, is seen to be something of a utilitarian approach, where building on the work of Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism argues that how the moral worth, the good, bad, and okay of a given action is determined through utilitarianism. So how do we do that? The value of any human action can be assessed according to the extent to which it contributes to the good of the community. So utilitarians are for common good. Now, this is all good in theory, and perhaps in 1918 this looks very promising. But we have to look at the set of events and histories that happened after 1918. So in the so-called intra-war period, the period between the First World War and the Second World War. Well, one thing is Great Depression, a sort of a total meltdown, total collapse of the global economy. Well, subsequently, the Second World War. The Second World War, in many ways, destroys any hope that we might have for things like, League of Nations and cooperation among states, etc. Furthermore, an event like the Holocaust certainly makes us question the inherent goodness or the sort of altruism of humanity. That maybe, makes us sort of reject the notion that human nature is inherently good. So one might ask ourselves, how did the intra-war period and the Second World War change general perceptions about rational behavior, cooperation, and utilitarianism? Well, I think it changes any, let me rephrase that. It crashes any understanding that human nature is inherently good. I think it just puts us in more of a nihilistic position where we just sort of say human nature is what it is. There is not much more to it. So, let's take a moment and take a step back and think about what classical liberalism does or did. Well, classical liberalism was optimistic about human nature. It argued that there was something inherently good about human nature, but that even better things come as a result of nurture or education. So there's faith in education, human progress, the sort of belief that human beings can be bettered, and the establishment of fair and just institutions. And in particular, that there is human progress through those fair and just institutions. So in the same system, human beings are seen as rational. They see there's an intrinsic value in classical liberalism given to human life. There is a moral worth to the individual, and there is something called inalienable human rights. Now, this leaves us in a position where we talk about the possibility of cooperation. And in many ways, classical liberals argue that states need to abandon self-help practices and that they need to collaborate and cooperate among themselves. And in many ways, states are not the only actors. Well, but like we talked about, in particular, events like the Second World War really challenges and damages that sort of like belief in the goodness and the cooperative nature of humans, and then sort of as institutions of human beings, states. So that takes us to what's called in international relations the leaner, meaner versions of the theories, where we talked about classical realism that argued that human nature was competitive and sort of self-interested, and classical liberalism arguing that human nature is altruistic and cooperative. the Neorealism and Neoliberalism takes the debate to a new place. So that's the Neo-Neo debate. Well, let's take a moment, let's take a little sidebar and think about what Neorealism is saying. Neorealism is in many ways the brainchild of this man. His name was Kenneth Waltz. He was an American academic who was dissatisfied with classical realism and its focus on human nature. And he wanted a more scientific, more provable, more tangible, more positivistic understanding of international politics as science. So Kenneth Waltz came up with the idea that classical realism was too focused on agency. And they argued that the likelihood of conflict was not something that emerged as a result of human nature, but rather due to the structure, the anarchic nature of international relations. So it was due to anarchy that the states were forced to sort of be self-interested and sort of seek conflict. So again, this takes us back to what we talked about in this class, the sort of the dual tensions of agency versus structure. What is the more dominant force? Is it agency or is it structure? And we've talked about this. We said agency is the capacity of an agent, and sort of whether that's a state or a person, and that individual's capacity to act independently and to make their own free choices. Now, let's take a moment and think about, I don't know if you've seen this movie, but the movie Matrix. So the next few slides are going to make a few Matrix references. In the movie Matrix, Neo is a coder that thinks that he is sort of like a hotshot hacker, and he's trying to figure out how to hack the system. So he meets with this other supposed hacker named Morpheus, and Morpheus says, everything that you think you know is not real. So I'm going to give you an option. You can choose the red pill or the blue pill, and if you choose the blue pill, you will wake up and you will see the truth, and if you take the red pill, you will go back to sleep and you will live your life as if this moment never happened. So now the question is, which pill does Neo take? Is Neo's choices determined by the structure, or is Neo making a choice? Well, as we later learn, Matrix is the structure, and Matrix determines sort of the actions of those that are involved in it. But Neo is, in the movie, the chosen one. So in many ways, if Matrix is the structure, Neo is the one that is able to sort of make choices within that structure, just like nobody else. So structure here refers to factors of social class, religion, gender, ethnicity that seem to limit or influence the opportunities that an individual might have. In this case, in international politics, anarchy is a structure. But for Neo is capable of seeing through the structure. Neo is capable of being one with the structure. So Neo's agency is quite different. So Neorealists argue that, again, classical realism bases analysis on human nature. So it focused on the ego and the emotions of world leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Churchill. thinking that it was in their bones, it was in their emotions, it was in their spirits that sort of the evil or the goodness lurked. But neorealist thinkers like Kenneth Waltz propose that structural constraints such as anarchy actually determines the state behavior. So it wasn't actually Hitler, it wasn't actually Stalin, it was the conditions in which those actors found themselves in that made them act the way that they have. Furthermore, international structure is defined by its ordering principle, anarchy, and the distribution of capabilities of states is measured by the number of great powers within an international system. So an international order that is bipolar, with two superpowers, is different than an international order with single superpower, or an international order with three superpowers. So in more concrete terms, the international order and how anarchy sort of acts within that international order is different when the United States is the only superpower versus during the Cold War when the United States was struggling against the Soviet Union as another superpower. Furthermore, probably for Kenneth Waltz, one might argue that international order is going to look differently as China becomes more and more a sort of a grounded superpower. And here, anarchy refers to the decentralized nature of the international and lack of a central authority, as we've talked about. So for neorealists, the way that international relations plays out is through these two dynamics. Well, first of all, we have something called a security dilemma, that there is a lack of trust among actors, and that states can either choose to be defensive or offensive in their approach to that said lack of trust. They can either build up their capacities or they can attack others. At the same time, in many ways, peace is sustained in international order through what's called a balance of power, where superpowers develop a natural balance among themselves. So in many ways, neorealists would argue that a bipolar world with two superpowers is more stable and less sort of likely to go to war than a uni-superpower, a single superpower world, where that single superpower might be more likely to use their power. Now, that's neorealism. Neoliberalism argues something else. Now, neoliberalism is often used to refer to economic developments that happen sort of late 70s onwards. But here we're talking about a combination of that, but also a combination of an emergence of an understanding of a new liberalism in international relations. So post-Second World War liberalism is built on Keynesian understanding of economic system. And it's also built on liberalization. And here, sort of the neoliberalism, as you might use it in everyday language, versus IR theory overlap, where it was about elimination of barriers. And at the same time, an emergence of globalization. Post-Second World War liberalism also is embodied through international organizations like the United Nations, but also through celebration of things like human rights and democracy. That's neoliberalism in action. Neoliberalism also sort of appears to be at the forefront of what we might call liberal peace and security in the 21st century. So for neoliberals propose that structural constraint such as anarchy forces states not to sort of seek conflict, but rather to cooperate. So it's not due to the human nature that states cooperate for neoliberals, it's due to anarchy. And that under neoliberal understanding of international politics, there's a distinct possibility of mutual wins. Now, some of you may have heard of the prisoner's dilemma, where two prisoners are put into a room or two separate rooms without knowing, or two criminals are put into a room and without knowing what the other is saying. They're given an option to either sort of cooperate with the authorities or avoid cooperation with the authorities. So if one prisoner turns on the other, then the one who turns on the other might get a shorter sentence and the other one might get a longer sentence. If both of them turn on each other, they might both get longer sentences. And if neither of them turn on each other, and if they cooperate, if they stay true to each other, they might just walk free from that interrogation room. So that's the understanding, in that cooperation happens because there is mutual wins. And within neoliberalism, institutions matter a lot, because institutions like the United Nations provide a structure for cooperation. So neoliberalism does not deny the anarchic nature of international system. They suggest that its importance and effects in international politics have been exaggerated, and that they claim that neorealists underestimate the possibility of cooperation, that cooperation happens regularly. Neoliberals believe that as pluralistic rational actors, states are likely to make decisions that provide the best outcome for their citizens. And that even in an anarchic system of autonomous rational states, cooperation can and does emerge through the building of norms, regimes, and institutions. We see this through International Monetary Fund, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Treaty, Ottawa Treaty on Landmines, or more currently, the World Health Organization, and they're sort of spearheading the efforts to build a vaccine against COVID-19. But what happens as a result of the neo-neo debate is a leaner and meaner mainstream discipline where neoliberals and neorealists are constantly sort of like arguing against one another. But within the bounds of neoliberalism, relations based on legal norms and moral principles should transcend power politics. So institutions or actors, international actors, could do things like peacekeeping. That it is within the understanding that an international organization like the UN could provide peacekeepers in conflict zones that are there to positively impact change and bring end to conflicts. In the same way, international institutions are central to the functioning of international politics, in that, for example, an organization like the UN Security Council is central to the functioning of international politics. Or collective security matters in instances like NATO, where international organization like NATO could bring together a number of countries that share a similar or common understanding of security, and they come together. But that liberalism should not be confused with pacifism. Neoliberalism in many ways actually is responsible or is a champion of a number of conflicts, like the conflicts in Iraq or conflicts in Afghanistan. And that economic and political strands of liberalism both argue that peace is possible. And that often happens. But one of the ways in which that they understand or they emphasize the role of international relations is through international law. Now, law is, loosely defined as rules or guidelines, a system of rules or guidelines. And that laws are enforced through social institutions that govern behavior. They're informed by a constitution. There's different types of laws, whether that's civil or common law. In Canada, we practice both of them. Quebec uses civil law, whereas other provinces use common law. That there's different focus to law. There's contract law, criminal law, property law, immigration law, etc., family law. And that there are different scales to laws, that there's ranging from municipal laws to international laws and anything in between. In terms of different kinds of laws, we can talk about national or international laws, private laws, or public laws. International law, for the purposes of this class, sets rules that are generally regarded as and accepted as binding in relation between states and nations. But it does not always mean that they're binding, and states, as the final actors, can always opt in or opt out of international laws. We might ask ourselves, well, what is the significance of international law? Or that, can we have international organizations and cooperation without international law or justice? And these are all good questions. Well, let's take the example of modern laws of warfare, or the international laws of modern warfare. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this, but wars have limits. Wars are actually quite legalized in that there is something called rules of engagement, and that laws of warfare define acceptable conduct within war, that there's a need to declare war. There is a procedure and acceptance of surrender. There is protocols on how to treat prisoners of war. There is distinctions between military necessity and proportionality, and that there should be a clear distinction between wartime and peacetime. For example, this document is the rules of engagement that were given to some American soldiers in Somalia during the events that eventually became the Black Hawk Down. These define when American soldiers can use deadly force or that they can fire their weapons. And as you see, remember, the United States is not at war. Treat all persons with dignity and respect. Use minimum force to carry out mission. Always be prepared to act in self-defense, but not just in any, like, don't use violence without it being self-defense. Another way of thinking about it is the Geneva Conventions. Geneva Conventions comprise of 4 treaties. I'm not going to ask you guys these questions, but Geneva Conventions, at least these Geneva Conventions, look at the idea of prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are people who get captured during the war. And if we think about how that concept has evolved over time, perhaps a good way to look at is the cultural depiction of prisoners of war. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Great Escape. I completely recommend it. Great movie. Where there's a certain understanding of prisoners of war during the Second World War versus prisoners of war in Japan during the Second World War, where a young Christian Bale impresses in the movie Empire of the Sun. Or you can look at the contemporary moment and ask yourself, what does a movie like Zero Dark 30 tell us about being a prisoner of war during the war on terror? And during 9/11 and the global war on terror, the understanding of what a prisoner of war is, or who a prisoner of war is, and what that concept entails changes. Things like enhanced interrogation or categories like unlawful combatants or illegal enemy combatants are introduced by the United States government to create a subset of categories of fighters, captured fighters, that do not become subject to Geneva Convention. The main assumption here being that if you fight for a terrorist organization, you are not fighting for a state, and as such, you've never signed the Geneva Convention. Right? Because terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda have never signed the Geneva Convention. As such, they should not be given the same privilege that soldiers captured for the state or by the state should be given under the Geneva Convention. Another question is, well, we don't necessarily have a clear distinction between war and peace. We have been living through the war on terror for the past, 20-something years. And almost 20 years. Yet we don't make a distinction because we are both at war, but it doesn't feel like at war. It sometimes feels like peace, but it's not peace. Well, if there is no distinction between war and peace, then that must have certain implications for something like the international law. And that takes us to a moment on the global war on terror, where perhaps neoliberalism hits its sort of major roadblock. Post 9/11, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the emergence of things like enhanced interrogation of suspected Al-Qaeda members and the creation of unlawful combatants and illegal enemy combatants that are not subject to Geneva Convention all sort of culminate towards one place in one moment, and that's Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is, again, another kind of exception. Guantanamo is under de facto U.S. sovereignty, meaning that the United States controls Guantanamo Bay, but it's technically on Cuban territory on a lease from Cuba that the current Cuban regime does not acknowledge. So then it's both inside and outside American laws, that it is an American base that is outside of American territory, so that American laws don't apply everywhere in the base. So on the one hand, that kind of inclusion and exclusion requires hyper-legal framework, but at the same time, it is outside of the legal system. Detainees that are held in Guantanamo Bay are often held there without proper charges and without any kind of time limits. And that's why American presidents since George W. Bush have been trying to close down Guantanamo Bay, or have been trying to send prisoners away from Guantanamo Bay, and are having a hard time establishing a legal framework of doing that, because the original framework of Guantanamo Bay was built on exception. So, how did Guantanamo Bay was it established? Well, like I said, it is on Cuban territory, but it is not in Cuba, or a territory of Cuba, but does not belong to Cuba currently, or that Cuba doesn't have control over it. And at the same time, It is both inside and outside of the United States. So you might ask yourself that historically that wars have limits, but maybe wars in post 9/11 don't have the same kinds of limits. So places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia are open for different kinds of interventions or non-interventions. Some might argue that this is a legal issue. Others might argue that this is power politics. Well, in many ways, we're seeing sort of like at times failures of neoliberalism to explain what's happening in world politics because we're seeing a single superpower, as Kenneth Waltz has predicted, dominate international order because they're not being challenged by other superpowers. That might change now that China is emerging, but we're not particularly sure how or when that will happen. So Guantanamo Bay and Guantanamo detainees represent an exception to the international law. But at the same time, if there are exceptions to the norm, then maybe the norm is defined by exceptions. And states act as sovereign in relation to the international law, so they decide upon the exception. There is, however, a risk of backlash. If a superpower constantly abuses or pulls out of international treaties, they might have unforeseen consequences. They might sort of witness or they might have to deal with consequences of other countries getting upset with them, as we've seen with sort of, perhaps the international community against Donald Trump's United States. So neoliberalism is an explanatory theory. It is not solving the world's problems. It is not creating a roadmap on how to sort of solve world's problems, but it is trying to explain to us how states cooperate with each other, why states cooperate with each other, when states cooperate with each other. So I hope this was helpful. This is the lecture on neoliberalism, where we also talked a little bit about neorealism, and we talked a little bit about classical liberalism. Thank you very much.